Hast thou not known? Hast thou not heard that the everlasting God, the Lord, the Creator of the ends of the earth, fainteth not, neither is weary? There is no searching of his understanding. He giveth power to the faint, and to them that have no might he increaseth strength. Even the youth shall faint and be weary, and the young men shall utterly fall. But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint. Again, may the Lord bless to us his holy and inspired word. Our text this afternoon is those last 4 verses, 28 through 31 of Isaiah 40. Brethren, I think it's a reality for all of us that all of us at times know what it is to be physically weary. At times our bodies grow weary. We feel physically exhausted. And the truth is, all we want to do is to lie down and rest. Indeed, rest and sleep are the body's mechanisms for the restoration of strength. And so all of us, to a greater or lesser extent, are familiar with such weariness. But physical weariness is not the only weariness that afflicts the Christian. As Christians, we are frequently those who suffer from spiritual weariness. Spiritual weariness is a weariness of the heart and of the mind, the weariness of the soul, of our innermost being. In many respects, spiritual weariness is more debilitating than even physical weariness. And it's more debilitating because of the intimate connection between the body and the soul. Spiritual weariness has a tendency to affect not only the soul, but the body as well. And so consequently, spiritual weariness can be exceedingly disabling. Spiritual weariness should be of concern to every believer, because every believer, as I say, suffers from it to one extent or another. You know, the scriptures reveal that even the greatest of saints suffer from spiritual weariness. Just a reflection upon the scriptures reveal that to be the case. Ask yourself, what caused Moses to say to the congregation of Israel, "Hear now, ye rebels, why must we fetch you water out of this rock?" And you might respond, well, that was an example of unrighteous anger. It was also reflective of spiritual weariness. 40 years of dealing with that difficult and sinful people as they made their way through the wilderness had taken its toll upon the meekest of all men. What led Elijah to go a day's journey into the wilderness and there to sit down under a juniper tree, as we read in 1 Kings 19 this afternoon? And what did he say there when he sat down under that juniper tree? He said this, "It is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am not better than my fathers." No doubt that incident involved a combination of factors. One of those factors was Elijah's spiritual weariness. You detect that spiritual weariness in what he says in verse 10 of 1 Kings 19. There he says, "I have been very jealous for the Lord God of hosts." That was true. For the children of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, thrown down thine altars, and slain thy prophets with the sword. That was also true. And he says, and this is his perception, and I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. Job was also one who experienced spiritual weariness. In Job 10 and verse 1, he declares, "My soul is weary of my life. I will leave my complaint upon myself. I will speak in the bitterness of my soul." Job experienced spiritual weariness. Here he indicates that life for him was a burden, so much so that Job, a man who feared God and who hated evil, was actually weary of living. David also endured weariness of the soul. And we sang of that this afternoon in Psalm 6, and particularly verse 6, where he writes, "I am weary with my groaning. All the night make I my bed to swim. I water my couch with my tears." Psalm 6 reflects the crushing mental anguish that David experienced in the course of his life. As is evident from our text this afternoon, the children of Judah, as they languished in Babylon, suffered spiritual weariness. What caused this spiritual weariness? What occasioned our spiritual weariness? It's not possible to exhaustively outline all of the causes of spiritual weariness, but all forms of spiritual weariness have this in common: a failure to look up, a failure to see the Lord, to see him as he truly is, and to wait patiently upon him. Brethren, spiritual weariness afflicts every believer, but the good news is that there is a remedy for such an affliction. Our text identifies the remedy. When we read there, "Even the youths shall faint and be weary, and the young men shall utterly fall." But notice this: "But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength." And so that's the subject of our sermon this afternoon: renewing our spiritual strength. I divided the sermon under just three questions, really: why, how, and with what assurance. Why do we need to renew our strength? How do we renew our strength? And finally, what assurance are we given as regards the renewing of our strength? Our text forms part of the Lord's words of comfort and encouragement directed through Isaiah to the children of Judah. And these words are directed to the children of Judah in anticipation of the 70-year captivity that they would endure at the hands of the Babylonians. At the time that Isaiah spoke these words here in verse 40, Judah, in fact, had not been taken into captivity by the Babylonians. Nonetheless, Isaiah had been given to see what awaited Judah, and he prophesied of the debilitating effect that the captivity would have upon the children of Judah. At the time that Isaiah prophesied, the Assyrians were the dominant world power. But it would not be long before Assyria would surrender that mantle, and that mantle would then be taken by the Babylonians. And so it would only be a relatively short time before the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar would seize Jerusalem and take the children of Judah into captivity. Isaiah warns Judah of the Babylonian captivity in the first 35 chapters of his prophecy. And then beginning in Isaiah 40, Isaiah proceeding on the basis that the Babylonian captivity would inevitably come to pass. Beginning in chapter 40, Isaiah begins to comfort the children of Judah in relation to the distress and hardship that they would encounter during the period of their captivity. The truth was that the Babylonian captivity would severely test the hope and the confidence of the children of Judah. The captivity, of course, would begin with the destruction of Jerusalem. The temple would be burned down. Judah's ability to worship the Lord would be taken out of their hands. And the captivity would result in deep anguish and sorrow for the children of Judah. And many of them will be forcibly removed from their homeland to a foreign land, and they would effectively be imprisoned in Babylon. And there, under the yoke of the Babylonians, there would be little or no prospect that the children of Judah would ever return to their homeland. And there in Babylon, they would suffer. They would be physically abused. They would be tormented by their captors, and they'd be forced to live in abject poverty. Life in Babylon would be exceedingly hard for the children of Judah. Everything would seem to be conspiring against them, and there would be no immediate relief in sight. Now, Isaiah knew that under such circumstances, the children of Judah would become weary, not only physically weary, but spiritually weary. They'd be sapped of their spiritual strength. The sapping of Judah's spiritual strength is evident from Psalm 137, with which you'd be familiar. Remember how that psalm goes. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. For there they that carried us away captive required of us a song, and they that wasted us required of us mirth, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. And the response of the children of Judah was, How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? You can detect in those words the weariness that eventually came upon the children of Judah in the captivity. A weariness born of the seemingly impossible circumstances that they faced there in Babylon. A weariness spawned of a life essentially devoid of hope, a life in which they had little or no joy, a life of ongoing hardship and pain. Isaiah knew that during the period of the captivity, the children of Judah would inevitably buckle under the weight of the burden that was imposed upon them. And if you're familiar with the history of the children of Judah in Babylon, that's precisely what happened. Languishing in captivity, the conclusion to which the children of Judah came was that the Lord had forgotten them. He'd abandoned them. He left them in the hour of their greatest need. And that's the import of verse 27 of Isaiah 40, where we read, Why sayest thou, O Jacob, and speakest, O Israel, my way is hid from the Lord, and my judgment is passed over from my God. That's what the children of Judah were actually saying. They were saying, my way is hid from the Lord. The Lord does not see. The Lord does not understand. and my judgment is passed over from my God. In other words, what they're saying there is that my rights are being disregarded by the Lord. You see, the children of Judah came to think that the Lord did not care about them anymore. He was not interested in their plight, and they concluded that the Lord had forgotten his covenant promises, that he was content to allow them to languish and suffer in Babylon, that their trials and their difficulties were really of no interest to him. Now, brethren, that was not true. But that was what the children of Judah concluded as they assessed their circumstances there in Babylon. The truth, of course, was that despite Judah's desperate circumstances, the Lord had not forgotten them, nor had the Lord cast them off. The truth was, in fact, that the Lord, even in the midst of the trials and the tribulations that they were experiencing in Babylon, the Lord was at work, working in and through Judah's captivity for their spiritual good. He was actually shaping and fashioning them as a people. Indeed, he was preparing them for their eventual return to Judah. The children of Judah didn't know that, but that's what was taking place at this time in the history of the children of Judah. Indeed, not only was he actually shaping and fashioning the children of Judah for their eventual return to their homeland, but the truth was he was actually preparing them for the coming of his Son and the salvation that was to be found in him. But in the midst of the hardships and trials of Babylon, the children of Judah had no sense of those things. All they could see were the difficulties. All they could relate to were the things that they were experiencing, and those things produced in them a sense of hopelessness and despair. They could not see the Lord at work. They had a very limited and narrow perspective of events as they unfolded, and consequently they could not see clearly what the Lord was actually doing. The truth was they actually struggled to contemplate a future full stop, let alone a future that might see them one day return to their homeland. It should be appreciated also that the sense of abandonment at the hand of the Lord suffered by the children of Judah was compounded by their recognition that it was their own sins that had actually brought all these things upon them. The Lord, of course, had warned them. Indeed, he had repeatedly warned them by his prophets. And the words of his prophets to the children of Judah were clear and unambiguous. But the children of Judah, as is also often true of ourselves, had refused to listen. The children of Judah knew that there was no one else to blame apart from themselves. They alone were responsible for their predicament. And so held captive in Babylon, the children of Judah little by little became overwhelmed by the seemingly hopelessness of their circumstances. They had no might. They didn't have the capacity to free themselves from the hands of the Babylonians. There's no one who was about to come to their aid. What could they do before the power and the might of Babylon? They were powerless, helplessly trapped there, away from their home. And the result was that the children of Israel, or children of Judah, were sapped of their strength. As I said, they became weary, physically weary, spiritually weary. And in their minds there was nowhere that they could turn for help, not even to the Lord. From their perspective, their ways were hid from the Lord, and he had no regard to their cause. Now, brethren, sometimes we experience that same sense of hopelessness, that feeling of abandonment, of an inability to deliver ourselves from those things that are taking place in our lives. It's also true that at times in those circumstances, the Lord seems to us to be very far away, perhaps even disinterested, apparently unconcerned with the burdens and the problems that we encounter every day. As a consequence, as we look to the future seems in many respects very bleak. And perhaps we even raise such questions in our mind as, will these things ever come to an end? Nothing ever seems to change. The prospects of change, sometimes in the midst of the difficulties and crises of our life, the prospects of change seem remote, if not non-existent. And so to contemplate change appears to be futile. We cannot see how things can possibly change. The issues confronting us seem to be insurmountable, one issue after another. There are the pressing issues involving family life. There are the demands of raising a family in the midst of a godless world. There are the never-ending spiritual battles that we face concerning our own spiritual walk and life. And in association with that, there are all the concerns and the anxieties that arise in our hearts and minds. Or perhaps the things that we encounter are troubles in our relationships, tensions in our marriage, hostility between parents and children, disagreements between friends and brethren. Or perhaps our difficulties relate to our health, or they relate perhaps to our financial circumstances, or they may be that we are experiencing pressures at work. And the truth is the list goes on. As we grapple with such issues, like the children of Judah, we are prone to conclude that our way is hidden from the Lord. The Lord doesn't appear to understand. And if he does understand, he doesn't seem to care. We seem to be left to battle